Hey guys, Dr. A here, and in this video we're going to be looking at angular kinetics, specifically looking at rotational inertia or moment of inertia, the conservation of angular momentum, as well as explain how Newton's first and second law can be used to describe the kinetics of angular motion. So I'm going to start off with figure skating. I am by no means a figure skater, but I think this video does a great job of applying or an application of the conservation of angular momentum. So check this out.
For decades, the Winter Olympic Games has drawn people from across the world to marvel at breathtaking athletics on the snow and ice. One of the most popular events is figure skating. Athletes meld acrobatics, dance, and physics into mesmerizing performances. It is the sheer precision that separates the skilled athlete from the novice. Through years of tireless training, skaters must learn to understand and use angular momentum to become the best in their sport. Angular momentum is the product of a skater's moment of inertia and angular velocity and is represented by the letter L. When the skater is rotating with no net external torque acting on her, angular momentum is conserved. With her arms and leg outward, she increases her moment of inertia, which reduces her angular velocity. As she pulls her arms and leg inward, she is able to spin faster since her angular velocity increases while her moment of inertia decreases. And this is how skaters become champions.
So aside from that overly dramatic ending, the video does a great job of describing angular momentum and the conservation of angular momentum. So before we dive a little bit deeper into conservation of angular momentum, it helps to review some of the concepts involved in Newtonian physics, specifically Newton's laws of motion. So Newton's first law states that an object that's at rest or moving at a constant velocity will remain in that state unless acted by an external force. The natural tendency of an object to resist that change in motion is what's known as inertia. And in linear motion, that is known as mass, right? If force is the product of mass times acceleration, and if you rearrange that equation, acceleration would be inversely proportional to its mass. So the resistance of a system to having its state of motion changed by an net external force is known as inertia. Hence, Newton's first law is known as the law of inertia. In the rotational sense, we're talking about angular motion. That resistance is known as rotational inertia, or mathematically known as the moment of inertia. That is provided by this equation here. Moment of inertia of an object or of a segment is equal to the sum of the segmental mass multiplied by the square of the radius of rotation, which is just a distance from the axis of rotation to a point of that segment. And if that rotation occurs about one of the principal axes of rotation, mainly the AP axis, superior inferior axis, or the medial lateral axis, we call that the principal moment of inertia, and is dependent on the segment's mass, as shown here, and what's called the radius of gyration, well, correction, the square of the radius of gyration, which is the distance from the axis of rotation to a point on the segment that in which the entire mass would be concentrated. Okay. So anyway, the way that you can interpret this moment of inertia is that it's dependent on both mass as well as position. The distribution of mass, very important, because in linear motion, mass is pretty much constant, right? And so the acceleration would only be dependent on what the net force is that is being applied to that. In angular motion, is dependent on not only mass, but it's dependent on the distribution of mass. And this leads me to the conservation of angular momentum, which is an extension of Newton's first law. Let me define momentum real quick. Momentum is just a state of motion. It's a quantity of linear, or in this case angular motion, is sometimes known as the inertia of motion. So anything that's moving has momentum. And in this sense, we are talking about angular motion, and that is calculated with this equation, which, as the video showed you earlier, L typically denotes momentum. I represents the moment of inertia, and omega here represents angular velocity. So according to the conservation of angular momentum, in the absence of a net external torque, the angular momentum of that system will remain constant. L1 equals L2. That means the momentum in position 1 should equal the momentum in position 2. So that means if the moment of inertia changes, position means that the person were manipulating where their arms are or where their legs are, and subsequently influence the moment of inertia. That's ultimately going to influence the angular velocity, what you see in terms of motion, because angular momentum has to remain constant in the absence of a net external torque. Best way to explain it is go back to that skater. I think many of you know when you see a skater tuck in their arms, they increase in speed. But why do they actually increase in speed? Well, according to conservation of angular momentum, the angular momentum in this first position here should equal the angular momentum in the second position. And what is she doing, or what does she do when she tucks in her arms like that to her moment of inertia? Does it increase or does it decrease? It decreases, right? Look here. The moment of inertia is greater here in this position than it is in the second position when she tucks it in, because she reduces her radii of gyration of her arms. Remember, it's squared, and subsequently significantly reduces the moment of inertia. She has reduced the resistance to angular motion, hence her angular velocity increases. So that's, keep in mind when you're talking about a skater that is rotating on ice, is obviously on ice, so there is no net external applied torque in this case. There's no friction. Okay? All right. So let's extend that over to Newton's second law, which is not any different for what we talked about in linear motion. So this time we're talking about torque. So it's the relationship, it's the change in angular motion that is due to a net torque applied to that system. So if it's not zero, it would tend to change the angular motion of an object, and that is dependent on the product, or is the product of moment of inertia and angular acceleration here. So angular acceleration, if we rearrange Newton's second law of angular motion, angular acceleration is directly proportional to the net torque and inversely proportional to the moment of inertia, as I mentioned earlier. Remember, moment of inertia is dependent not only on mass, but the distribution of mass. Very important concept. So in most situations in human movement, whether we're talking about running, walking, or throwing a baseball, throwing a football, throwing a javelin, swinging a bat, swinging a golf club, the way that humans are able to maximize their efficiency, which is the output that's created from the same torque, or minimize the torque required for a certain movement, is by manipulating moments of inertia. So let's take this runner for example. Actually, sorry, we'll take these two runners. I think you can probably tell which of these two runners is more experienced, more seasoned, and let's concentrate on their respective right legs here. This is right at the end of the swing phase, right when the left foot would reach initial contact. And in this position, the runner on the left, because the knee is slightly flexed, or I should say more extended as compared to the runner on the right here, her radius of gyration, the radius of gyration of the left runner here, is longer than the radius of gyration of this runner here, because look at her knee. It's more flex, right? Just say that's 90 degrees of flexion, and this is roughly, 60 degrees. But because of that, the differences in position, and in this case, knee flexion angle, the radii of gyration is different for each of the runner. Knowing what you know about the moment of inertia, which of these two runners would have a higher moment of inertia in hip flexion extension in this case? Good. The runner on the left would have a higher moment of inertia because, as you know, moment of inertia is equal to mass times the square of the radius of gyration. So therefore, the acceleration that's created by that hip flexor, for example, because she's swinging her leg forward, she's using her hip flexors to cause that leg to swing forward. We'll call hip flexion. Where if it's the same torque that's created by both runners, the runner on the right will get more acceleration because there's less resistance, so hence she's more efficient, right? So it's all about positions. That's how we're runners, for example, and other athletes are able to be more efficient at what they do by position, by maximizing the output created by the muscular contraction, which creates force and subsequently creates torque. Cool. Now let's talk a little bit about baseball here. That's the baseball hitting. When a baseball hitter is swinging the bat and trying to hit a home run or trying to make contact, it's best for that hitter to hit the ball at the sweet spot of the bat. What exactly is the sweet spot? It is known as the center of percussion. Let me back up to a few lectures ago when I talked about centric and eccentric force. A centric force is one in which it would cause linear motion of an object, while an eccentric force will cause both linear and angular motion. If that eccentric force is at the right spot in that particular segment or system, it would cause pure rotation. With a bat, what is the hitter trying to do? He's rotating the bat, right? Rotating the bat and trying to hit the ball in the sweet spot. The sweet spot or center of percussion is the point on the bat where you have pure rotation. Anywhere else will have a combination of linear and angular motion, and what the runner or what the batter would feel is vibration. That vibration is due to that combination of linear and angular motion if they hit it anywhere other than the sweet spot of the bat, the center of percussion. In between the center of percussion and the center of gravity of the bat is what's known as the radius of gyration. As I mentioned earlier, this is the point at which the entire mass of the bat would be concentrated. And you would use this to calculate the moment of inertia of a bat. So that's just a quick overview on the different points of interest, what we call inertial properties of a segment, in this case of an object. Okay, so I want to finish up with a chat about centripetal acceleration. In the previous video, I talked about when an object is turning or going in a circular motion, they're constantly changing direction. So therefore, there's acceleration, and that acceleration is known as centripetal acceleration. That is directed towards the center of rotation, and that can be calculated using this simple formula here, where centripetal acceleration is equal to the tangential velocity squared divided by the radius. So looking at that equation, which would have more effect on centripetal acceleration? Tangential velocity or the radius? Tangential velocity, right, because it's squared. Now, like I mentioned earlier, an object in motion would want to stay in a straight line. So because you're constantly changing direction when you're moving in a circular path here, there is a force that's trying to tend to keep it towards the center, trying to fight it. That we call that a centripetal force. It's the force that is needed to maintain a circular path. And if we take this discus thrower here, he is rotating. I believe he goes 3 to 5 revolutions until he releases that disc. He is maintaining that circular path by centripetal force that is mainly due to the ground reaction force, in this case the frictional force, interaction between his shoes and the ground itself. He's basically creating impulse and then releases it so that it can be released at the maximum linear speed possible and subsequently travel farther as possible. And so that is maintained by centripetal force. Now, we see the same thing in various types of injuries. This right here is called a nursemaid's elbow, where if you have, I don't know why it's called nursemaids, but that's just the name of it. Let's just say you have mom here or a babysitter, and she's basically trying to swing her daughter or swing this child around like this. So because she's moving in a circular path, there is centripetal acceleration, and subsequently there's centripetal forces that would tend to pull on the elbow. And specifically, a nursemaid's elbow is one in which the radial head here, there's the radius, it's the ulna, would sublux underneath the annular ligament. So it can be painful, definitely not an injury that you would want. In some cases, the elbow would be able to absorb some of that energy through a contraction of the elbow flexors and elbow extensors, depending on the child, the age of the child, and whether or not the growth plates have closed, and there are some other factors that that would affect the clinical etiology of this injury, but the overall biomechanical aspect of it is the centripetal forces that are involved in pulling that elbow apart, if you will. Okay, so lastly, I definitely can't talk about centripetal acceleration without talking about baseball pitching. Why? Because the entire segmental motion is all about rotations. Remember I talked about the kinematic sequence of pelvic rotation and trunk rotation, shoulder internal axonal rotation, and elbow flexion extension. Well, all that rotation creates centripetal effects. And those centripetal effects equate to what's called non-muscular torque, which is a torque that is due to muscular activity that occurs in the proximal larger segments of the kinetic chain. So the movement of the pelvis and the trunk, for example, can be felt, or at least the energy of which can be felt in the throwing arm through this segmental motion in the kinetic chain. And that that magnitude of those torque has a lot to do with the centripetal and what's called the Coriolis effects of these torque. Anyway, that is a separate lecture altogether, but just kind of summarize here, because the various segments are rotating at a certain angle of velocity, changing angle of velocity here, there is centripetal effects that occur throughout the motion itself, such as baseball pitching.